Hi guys. I'm going to do this lecture in two parts, just because there's a lot of material to cover here, and I feel like it's best taken in two bites, um, rather than overload you with everything. There's a lot of stuff to Hegel and to Kierkegaard, and then when we get into Marx, Nietzsche, and the principles of utility as put forth by Bentham and Mill, uh, there's so much there. So today I'm going to give you, or in this, not today, but in this lecture, I'm going to give you some Hegel, some Schopenhauer, and Kierkegaard, and then there will be a second lecture with Marx, Nietzsche, and the idea of utility. One thing I want to do is I feel like I have to begin every one of these by apologizing. I had mentioned last week that you had a class presentation due. I apologize because I got you mixed up with my other class, and trying to get them organized to do their presentation just got it mixed up in my head. So I apologize for that, and whatever anxiety that might have caused you. Didn't mean to do that because God knows you're probably having enough anxiety as of right now. Look, the other thing I want to say is if you're having trouble completing your assignments and getting everything in, then it would be wise if you let me know sooner rather than later, so that I can try to help you with that. We can even set up a Zoom call so that we can discuss what it is that you're struggling with, and I would be more than happy to try to help you with that. I hope by next week to tell you exactly how we're going to do the final exam. It's still going to be a vocabulary exam. Maybe I put you guys into some groups. There's a way to do that via Canvas. So if I can figure that out enough, I'll get you maybe put into groups so that you can work. You can decide which terms you want on the exam. I just have to check some things out with the people who put Canvas together for us, so that I can see how best to do that to make it a really good assessment of what you've learned as far as vocabulary. Incidentally, it's at this point in the semester that I would be ending class a little bit early, and we would be starting to go over those terms so that you could study them. So that's the other thing that I'm contending with, is trying to allow for time to do that. So I'm going to work on that in the next few days. So today I want to begin by looking at Hegel, and he is, well, let me back up and just begin to say that we're entering, this section is beginning what is commonly known as continental philosophy. Continental philosophy meaning the continent of Europe. It is not really going on in the British Isles or in the Americas, of course. This is the emergence of continental philosophy. There will be, of course, some ideas that come from the British Isles to the continent that are used, and we will see those for certain. But what is emerging now is what is commonly known as continental philosophy. You can actually take courses and major in continental philosophy alone, because it does become so broad. And what we begin to see is philosophy begins to branch out in a number of ways that are just beyond the metaphysics, the ethics, aesthetics, those sorts of things that we talked about at the very, very beginning of the semester. That's not to say, however, that that we depart from those essential understandings or branches of philosophy. It's just to say that the way that philosophy begins to specialize and focus in certain areas of that philosophy, it seems like we're getting into some various areas. So, for example, the first one we're going to talk about today, Hegel, uh, he is kind of thought of as the father of the philosophy of history. In fact, if you go on and you become a history major, especially if you go on to do graduate work, I would say it's 100% certain that you will encounter Hegel when you begin to study historiography, because it's Hegel that approaches history in a philosophical way that we begin to approach history of philosophy. And in fact, in some sense, one could argue that outside of, well, no, even inclusive of, to some extent, inclusive of even your STEM programs, your STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering, math. If you take a Hegelian approach, that's Hegel's approach, you could make the argument that all learning, all knowledge is essentially a study and understanding of history. So think about it for a moment. Everything that we've done in this class and everything that we're doing in this class, even though we're talking about philosophy, we are in essence talking about history and the history of ideas. If you study math, you have to understand some of the concepts as they were developed in the past in order to apply them to current problems to find solutions. Same thing with psychology. You have to go back and you have to study. In some sense, you have to study some philosophers and other things like that to begin to understand where psychology has brought us to today. And graduate school then is where ideally you begin to take on and develop new ideas through research. But if you don't have that history, you can't really do that. Even law, okay, I'm just going to put it out there. If you're a criminal justice major or you're something like that, to study law, you're essentially studying the history. So these were the laws that were enacted and passed, and why they were enacted and passed, and why they're on the books today. So all of that then is really a study of history. You might argue, well, what about medicine, nursing? Yeah, even that. Because you are learning what worked and what didn't work. You're learning what worked and what didn't work in order to be able to apply that knowledge to your patients today. The anatomy that we study, you might participate in dissecting a cadaver, but for the most part, you're not doing that. You are looking at the anatomy that someone else has studied and has told you how the systems of the body works. How does the endocrine system work? How does the digestive system work? That's essentially a study of history. And you're then learning how to apply that historical knowledge then to the patients that you're dealing with. And so Hegel would be perfectly comfortable with this as kind of the father of the philosophy of history. So in a sense, all knowledge that we acquire up until this point in our lives is in some sense history, and we're coming to understand history. It's only as we begin to become researchers or maybe do academic work in philosophy or some science that we take it beyond history. But we can't take it beyond history or beyond that point in history without understanding all the principles of that have gone into the past. So I hope that makes sense. If we were in class, I would certainly want to ask you if that's clear or not. So everything then that we know is sort of a study of history, and in order to take it forward, we have to understand everything that's been done before. I hope that's clear. I hope you're clear with what I'm understanding, because as we get into Hegel, that is where he, I think, makes the greatest contribution to us in the area of philosophy. Now, you can look at his idea of being and nothingness, but that goes into essentially what I'm going to explain to you today. That's commonly known as the Hegelian dialectic. Hegelian dialectic. H-E-G, let's see if I can find that. H-E-G-E-L-I-A-N. Dialectic. D-I-A-L-E-C-T-I-C. Hegelian dialectic. And so Hegel teaches us a few essential things. Number one, he teaches us that as we understand history, we understand what has happened in the past, it informs then about what is going on today. Now, that's going to become very clear in just a moment. But we must understand everything in the past if we're going to understand what's happening in our world today. So history then teaches us about the life we're living today. He also teaches us that progress isn't necessarily linear. So linear, by that, of course, I mean a straight line. So if this is progress and you think that it's going to be a straight line, most of you have lived enough by now to understand that there is no linear progress. We move forward, we move back. We move forward, we move back. Now, ideally, we're always making progress, but it is not just a single line in which we always move forward. There are zigs, there are zags, there are ups, there are downs to life that then challenge how we move forward. And so we have to accommodate those changes, the vicissitudes of life, if you will. You've probably experienced it. Hell, we're experiencing one right now. The fact that we thought when we began the semester back in, when was it, January, we thought we were going to meet every Monday evening for, 13 weeks, and then have a final exam, and we'd be, we're good. We got this. And then, fuck me, a pandemic happened. And now we're learning in this way. That is to say, again, to emphasize, what Hegel teaches us is that progress is not linear. It doesn't just move forward like this. It moves more like this. There are ups, there are downs, there are zigs, there are zags, there are loops, and however you want to say it, but it just doesn't always work out exactly as we understand it. Hegel also teaches us that we should learn from those with whom we disagree. We shouldn't dismiss someone just because we have a difference of opinion. The Hegelian dialectic is at its essence learning from those who we disagree with. So Hegel would put it this way. You have an idea. Let's call that the thesis. Okay? Thesis. T-H-E-S-I-S. You're talking to your friend or your parents or your neighbor, or you're talking to your professor, and they say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but, or they say, yes, that's true, however, or they say, yeah, I get what you're going at, and you might consider this. And so they then offer you the opposite of your thesis that we would call the antithesis. So you have thesis on the one hand, and you have the antithesis that's offered by someone with whom you might disagree, on the other hand. So your thesis and your antithesis. And Hegel would say that as you learn from your antithesis, that informs your thesis on this sense, on this side. And so Hegel would then say that as you learn from whom you disagree and you understand that history is not linear and you're trying to learn from the past, you then come together, you bring that antithesis together with your idea, and you form a new idea which Hegel would call the synthesis. So the thesis, the antithesis, form the synthesis. Okay? I'll get more into that in just a moment. So history then makes progress by bumbling from one thing to another. And so when we're talking about Hegel and all of this, and I'm telling you about thesis and antithesis, we're not just talking about ideas. Hegel believed this was literally how the world worked. That there was always on the one hand and then on the other, and as those two things began to struggle with each other, they would form then something new, yet a third way. And that's the whole essence of trying to understand being and nothingness, being, nothingness, and becoming. That's, in fact, if you look on page 240 of your textbook, you'll see the terms that I'm talking about: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Okay? In fact, Hegel thought that, generally speaking, it takes about 3 moves before we can find the right balance for whatever it is that we're dealing or we're addressing. So let me illustrate for you how this thesis, antithesis, synthesis works. Okay. I know it's going to be backwards. I haven't mastered how to write backwards so that you can see it correct. But here we have your thesis. In your textbook, how Hegel arrived at this was trying to understand being and nothingness and the idea of becoming. Read that in your textbook. I want you to understand this essential principle. That is, yes, that's important, but here's how I want you to see it. So you have a thesis, as I was just explaining. Then you meet with someone with whom you might disagree, or you might meet with objections, you might meet with whatever it is. So let's just say, we're putting it in terms of history. I'm going to invade England like the Spanish Armada was planning to do. And of course you have Queen Elizabeth I, she's trying to prevent that from happening, but the antithesis of that is something else. In this case, it was a massive storm off the coast, and the Spanish couldn't navigate those seas. And so their ships, the Armada, was essentially destroyed and the sailors lost. And what came out of that was the synthesis then, the emergence of the golden age of the Elizabethan era, the Elizabethan period. That then becomes the synthesis. So when we're talking about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we're not just talking about ideas, as you might think of as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So these are not just ideas. For Hegel, this is how history actually works. This is how history actually progresses. Now, as we understand then Hegel, what we can essentially then begin to learn is that this synthesis becomes a new thesis. Okay, you got it? So the Elizabethan era gives way to yet something else. I'm not going to keep boring you with history talk like that. But then that synthesis becomes the next thesis. And then if you can follow this, you can understand. Your textbook has this on page 240, but I thought I would illustrate it so I could show it to you. Here was your original thesis. Here was the alternative idea or the event that happened. that then alters how you were looking at things or how your ideas were emerging or whatever you want to say. And that then gives way to the synthesis. That synthesis then becomes the basis for a new thesis. And every new thesis then, or every new event, has its countervailing or opposing antithesis. So something comes along to challenge the norm, if you will. So the synthesis becomes the norm or the thesis. And then something challenges that norm. And then those two together then emerge to create a new synthesis. And the synthesis becomes what? The thesis. That's right. And as that new thesis then emerges, that new event emerges, there's something to counter it over here, which Hegel calls the antithesis. And then they together form a new synthesis. And so this keeps going on throughout history, according to Hegel. So it's not just ideas, it's events that happen as well. So events and ideas that happen in this way, Hegel thought of it as, or he named it the Hegelian dialectic. Dialectic meaning two. That's where the dia comes on. So it's sometimes called dialectical or Hegelian dialectic. So that's what you need to understand essentially from Hegel. So just like this happens in history, this happens in our lives. So maybe your plan originally was to go to school and become a veterinarian. But what happened? I don't know. Let's say you got pregnant. So the antithesis of that. So you decided, well, I still want to go to school. I still want to do something else with my life. And so you decided to go to school for, I don't know, a radiological tech or something. I don't know. And then as you become that radiology tech and you're working that career, I don't know, you meet a doctor and you kind of hit it off, the two of you, and you thought you were just going to be a radiology tech for a while, and now you're in a relationship with this person, and lo and behold, you get married. Oh, yeah, we get married. And that then becomes the basis for a new dialectic that then begins to happen, because as you get married, you have to deal with the new family as your in-laws and things like that. And as you do that, you come to a new synthesis of things. And that becomes then the foundation for the new dialectic, because all of a sudden you and that doctor that you met and you have a relationship with now, you're going to have another child. So here you have a child back here, and now you're going to have another child. That then creates a new synthesis, and that becomes the thesis for the next dialectic. I hope that begins to help you understand. I'm simplifying it very much, but this is what the Hegelian dialectic is. And if you don't get anything else out of Hegel, get this out of Hegel, because he believed that this is how history then would progress. And that's why Hegel believed that we needed certain institutions in our life to help us keep some resemblance of what is normal, to keep all of this moving forward. The institutions are what implement the ideas. So the synthesis, the institutions are what then they implement the ideas the synthesis, the new thesis that we come up with, and that's what keeps us moving forward. So whether it's the family through marriage, or whether it's the university advancing ideas and always teaching what was happening in the past in order to understand and move forward in the future, or whether it's government. Government is the ultimate implementer of ideas, as we call them, laws. And you look on the books, the laws that were in effect in 1790 in New Jersey, they're not necessarily the same laws that are in effect nowadays. They've always emerged and given way to new laws or a synthesis as new things that have happened. Think about it this way. those who argue, for example, that the Second Amendment should be altered. So on the one hand, you have the Second Amendment. That's the thesis here. On the other hand, you have people who say, well, you know, when the Second Amendment was written, they didn't envision semi-automatic weapons. You know, it took 30 seconds to reload a muzzle loader. So the antithesis of the Second Amendment for them becomes some type of gun control or gun safety. And you have to then, there is some compromise because you can't just own a machine gun like they would have in the military. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to own a tank. You're not allowed to own a bazooka. There are certain things you can't. And so even though we still have the Second Amendment, and there are people who would want to do other, place many other restrictions, the synthesis is, okay, there are certain things you can't do, but yet we still want to keep that Second Amendment. So as the Second Amendment then was envisioned in New Jersey and throughout the early states, the colonial period, as the thesis of the Second Amendment, it's changed. And that then will keep moving forward. So that's why Hegel believed that it took essentially like 3 moves. Another example of this is during the Victorian era. During the Victorian era, the idea of love was largely centered around the purity and the virginity of women, and this idea of chastity and those things, of this purity and all of this. Well, by the time you get to the 1960s, so if over here we have the Victorian era, where everything is so pure and simple and polite, which it actually really wasn't. But you have that over here as one idea. By the time you get to the 60s, you have a whole nother idea. Free love, sex for everyone, so on and so forth. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, especially by the late 60s and early 70s. But then you look at today, the idea, especially of a lot of millennials and some in your age group, is, yeah, we could have sex. It's not that important to us. I don't know. That's what I've read, what I understand from things I've looked into. Yeah, we could have sex. We'll have sex. We'll hook up. We'll do that. But there are other things to life other than just that. So you have this thesis and this antithesis, and then maybe we're emerging to a new synthesis of how we understand love and sex and things like that. In the Victorian era, you had to be married. In the 60s, you didn't want to be married. And nowadays, marriage, yeah, maybe not. We just hook up. We have friends with benefits, things like that. So the institution there would be perhaps the institution of relationships, friendships, marriage, anti-marriage. I don't know. All right, let's move on because, my goodness, we're already 30 minutes into this and we still have 2 other philosophers to talk about, and I'll have to do another video in just a few moments to get the others in. So then we'll want to move on to talk about a little bit about Schopenhauer. I don't want to say too much about Schopenhauer. I do want to address some of his philosophy. Schopenhauer had a couple of ideas. Now, the first one that I'll put out here for you is not. It's not going to make sense until you understand a little bit more about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer believed that music is a unique experience, and it reflects the best of the world. And there is a purpose and there's a need for music. And for Schopenhauer, that was extremely important. He also believed, and this is a very Buddhist idea, I believe, he believed that human existence is unfulfilled because it's always striving. The Buddhists teach that life is suffering, and the reason we suffer is because of our desire. I think Schopenhauer would definitely agree with the Buddhists. Excuse me. because Schopenhauer believes that life is essentially about this unfulfilled struggle, this unfulfilled striving for something, trying to achieve things. And that he thinks that redemption, then, the redemption of life, comes essentially through a change in our consciousness. Well, I'll say more about that. But it's a change in consciousness where desire ceases, and you essentially come to a state of resolution. And so for Schopenhauer, then, there are two aspects to the world. And if you want to follow along with this, you can begin to look on page 250. He gives an illustration of this. So if you're looking on page 250, on the left-hand side, you have the first aspect of the world according to Schopenhauer. This is what we see in manifest images. In other words, you look behind me, you see this orderly, somewhat orderly office. You can't see what's on the other side of the camera. My desk is covered. My office gets quite messy at times. But you look behind me and you see diplomas on the wall, you see books on the shelves, you see maybe a picture of me and my wife there, some figurines. Oh, there's a Buddha, there's a menorah, there's a cross, a monstrance, there's a drum from Africa. You see all of that, and it appears to be orderly. It appears to be arranged in space and time. And so that is the image that I'm trying to manifest to you. That's what I'm trying to project so that you will see, wow, he's really got it all together. But Schopenhauer says there is another world that's there. I alluded to the disarray that's on my desk in front of me. Well, Schopenhauer would say this is the world as it is in itself. It is then the essence of everything. And he called this the world as will, W-I-L-L. And it is consciously or unconsciously tending toward some end. He used the term the will to life. So that is then where the strife begins to happen. So this behind me then, even though that's what you see, it's really my attempt then to make order out of the struggle and the strife that I'm undergoing to try to survive in this world. That this world, this will to life, is essentially about strife and survival and reproduction. And even when we can get what we want, so I got the order back here, it's only temporary. Just think of it in this way. One of these days, I'll choose to move. I'll retire from this job. And I'll give away most of those books. There's other books over here and books over there and books over there. I'll give them all away. Because what good will they do me when I'm retired? Yeah, I'll probably still teach a few classes because I enjoy it. But, I won't need all of this. I've read those books. So even when we can attain some momentary fulfillment of our desires and our want for an organization within space and time, it's only temporary. And so life then just becomes yet another manifestation of strife and struggle and survival. It never ends. So that's why Schopenhauer is sometimes said to be he was said to be, I believe, one of the first um, uh, openly an avowed atheist, but also that he is the father of pessimism because it's ultimate futility. He says that even because we're given to this strife and this sense of survival, that one of the apex of that, the chief manifestation of that sense of trying to survive and is the act of reproduction. We know it as sex, of course, and he believed that the genitals then become, I don't know why I did that when I said genitals, the genitals then become the focus of our will. And even if we think of sex as something that we look to as being fulfilling, as we find a partner with whom we can share that intimate experience, and God, he's so handsome, I want his genes for my children, or she's so beautiful, I want her genes for my children. I bet I can breed with her in some way. I know I'm being very animalistic, but that's what Schopenhauer would have said. And he would have said, sex is not really about sex. It's about reproduction. Reproduction so that you survive. Now you got to remember that Schopenhauer is writing at a time when Darwin is beginning to put forth ideas of evolution. Not just Darwin, that's the thing, but people often think of Darwin. Darwin was just the one who published On the Origin of the Species. There were others talking about evolution and evolutionary terms during this time. And so for Schopenhauer, he sees this, he agrees with this, that look, it's all about survival. It's all about reproduction, just so that we can survive. And so then for Schopenhauer, if you wanted to redeem yourself in any way, if you wanted to ultimately relax from all this struggle and this strife and this need to survive, then you just need to have a sense of resignation. That would be the best way to live. Schopenhauer thought then that the best way to achieve that resignation, that relief from the sense of struggle, was through music. Art and aesthetic things, yes, but music, he thought, was what was most effective at soothing the will. Because he thought that then that music could reflect this struggle, this strife, and this sense of resolution that we would achieve. Now, for him, there have been people who have I guess argued about what type music would best characterize then, if music is the solution because it soothes the will of humanity and allows us to achieve some sense of resignation. What music then would be best? And some have said that Wagner would have been probably the best manifestation of Schopenhauer's belief. So the musical manifestation of Schopenhauer might have been Wagner, Wagner, I believe it is. Pronounced Wagner, not Wagner, Wagner. And when I think of that, I think of Wagner's famous, albeit unfinished, opera known as The Wedding. So this was an opera put forward by Wagner, and I think the fact that it's unfinished is one thing it's absolutely remarkable to contemplate in relation to Schopenhauer. But then also it has that famous tune, Many of you probably know the tune. You might have had it at your wedding, or you might want it at your wedding. It's sometimes called the Wedding March by Wagner, and it goes something like dun 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 dun. You know that one? Yeah, you're humming it now. Yeah, there you go. You probably hum it better than me. The reason I think that best describes Wagner, the bride ends up dead. Yeah. So better think carefully before you have that at your wedding, or you might want to rethink it if you had it at your wedding, what it actually means. So the chaos, the striving, the struggle ends in death, and so the fact that it's unfinished, there doesn't achieve a resolution then to that. I don't know. I'll leave that for you to think about and go on. We're now 40 minutes into this lecture, and now I need to move on to one of my favorite philosophers, Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher. Again, one of my absolute favorite philosophers. He wrote so many works before he died in his early 40s. He's known as the father of existentialism. The way I like to think of existentialism, the way I like to define it, it is the contemplation of life itself, the contemplation of existence. So existentialism. So it's the philosophy of life and existence in a purposeless and irrational world. So that's existentialism. So how do you find purpose and meaning in life, in your existence, in the midst of a purposeless and irrational world? Now, to be an existentialist, you have to believe that the world is purposeless and irrational, and that you have to be a little bit like Schopenhauer. But Kierkegaard was able to make sense of it, and I'll tell you. But as I was saying, he wrote so many works before he died in his early 40s. I think it was age 41, but don't quote me on that. Maybe 42, 43, something like that. But most of his works he published under a pseudonym. So he didn't publish them in his own name. Many of them were later found out to be published by him. They didn't know it while he was living. So it's only in retrospect that he put these things out. In fact, there was one year, I think he published 3 books. But here's some of the titles. I love this. This is a Kierkegaard anthology. It's one of my favorite books. I've read sections and parts of it over the years, used it so many times in papers I've written. So I'm just going to give you a few of the titles of the things he's written. One of them called Either Or. Either Or. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Another one, Fear and Trembling. Another one, Stages on Life's Way. This one I love. I love the title. Concluding Unscientific Postscript. Works of Love. Yeah, you think that's not what it's about, really. Sickness unto Death. Training in Christianity. And some of his final works. In fact, I think this one was not entirely finished, but I'm not sure about that. The Act Upon Christendom. The Attack Upon Christendom. So Kierkegaard, he is a Christian, but he thinks most people are not Christians, at least as he understood it in the Danish state church. So when we talk about Kierkegaard, so he is the father of existentialism, and that is the philosophy of life and existence in a purposeless and irrational world. So he thought that we should abandon our sentimentalism And he did this by attacking the things, the institutions in which we put so much trust, like the family, our work. He even attacked love. And he believed that all of this could be that all of this was purposeless and had no meaning. He had a grudge against these things because from a very early age, he experienced a great deal of death. I forget how many siblings that he had, but by the time he reached into his 40s himself, all but one brother had died. All of his siblings had died. I believe his parents had died at that point as well. I'm certain they had. And so he just believed that life was kind of purposeless, meaningless. And so how do you then make sense of life? How do you find meaning in life in the midst of its meaninglessness and purposelessness? So, for example, Kierkegaard saw love as one of the things. So when he wrote, what was it called? I have to go look at it again here. Works of Love. What was he talking about? What could he possibly have against love? Well, he saw love as problematic because you had two extremes and two choices. In fact, he broke off an engagement with a young woman who he loved very much. And he was very passionate toward her. He desired her. He was just driven by these passions for love for her. But he lived at a time when the norm, of course, was marriage, domestic life. And he thought that to have that to be married would kill any passion and any desire that you could possibly have. Partly because one would begin to have children and such. And so you might have, this might be your experience, you might have seen it in movies or in television shows where the couple, they have to schedule their sex life, and it's like, guess we're going to do it. We're going to have sex. And Kierkegaard thought that was the case. It became a chore. The passion and the desire was gone. And so he thought that to have that passion and desire was not compatible with domestic life and marriage. And so that's why he broke off a relationship with someone that he loved very much. He's not a very encouraging guy, is he? Well, anyway, in his work called Either Or, he argued that there's no way to win. So to go back to marriage or not. If you marry, okay, you're with the person that you are passionate about, but you're going to lose that passion because you're with that person for the rest of your life. So to marry or not marry, you can't win. To work, yeah, you have money, but you're miserable from working. Well, to not work, you might be able to pursue your pleasures, your desires, if you could somehow find the money. So to work or not work, it's ultimately then it's either or, but it's unfulfilling. He even came to the point of talking about killing yourself. Kill yourself, you get out of this, but then you will have escaped, but to live, you're miserable, but if you're dead, you don't get to enjoy anything, and so either or, there is no way to win. And so Kierkegaard then began to say that laughter was the only and perhaps best solution. Laugh, yeah, because the opposite is just to cry about the fact that there is no way to win. Well, he later then went on to talk about, in another work on anxiety, he began to he coined the term of angst. Angst. You might have used this term, you might have heard this term, but it's the sense of realizing that there are no good answers, that you really, do or do not. There is no try, but he would just say do or do not and just be happy with either doing or not doing, because there's no good answer. And so to find then purpose and meaning in life was in that sense futile, because whichever direction you go, however you do, you're ultimately going to come up with whatever you come up with. And so that was this sense of angst. Out of all the solutions, there can really be no good one. He said it this way, and I'm quoting from him: life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So if you think about being in, I don't know, think about being in a car, you're looking in the rearview mirror, so you know where you've been, but you can't drive the car and go forward looking in the rearview mirror. You have to keep looking forward. The way that I heard, I think his name is Jim White from Covenant House, said, look back but don't stare. Look back but don't stare. So life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So happiness for Kierkegaard is impossible because of this constant state of discontent. You didn't choose to be born, and for the most part, you won't get to choose when you die. So, good luck with that. Of course, we know that in New Jersey, we can choose when we die under certain circumstances. So for Kierkegaard, this is the state of humanity. And he thought that there was only one possible solution, and that was Christianity. He thought that in knowing the Christ of the Gospels, you could then find meaning in life. You could find some purpose in a meaningless world. But he was very careful, and this is why he attacked Christendom, because what he saw as the state church, the organized religion of his day, he thought that that was not true faith. That was a sense of just organized rituals that people practiced, and it gave them some sense of satisfaction and order, but ultimately that was not real Christianity. There had to then be what he termed, and this became a phrase that he coined as well, the leap of faith. He talks about the night of faith, as in the K-N-I-G-H-T, the night of faith. And in this, you have to take a leap of faith. So to truly then find meaning in life, you have to abandon your skepticism, and you have to take a step toward God in faith. You have to leap out in faith, and that is the only way that then you can find purpose and meaning in this life. I'm reminded every time I think of this of the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. When Indiana, I think it's the Last Crusade, when Indiana is trying to save his father, and he does a couple of things there, and he acts on faith. It's a very old movie. I know I'm dating myself here, but in one scene, as he's trying to find it's the one. It's not Last Crusade, is it? It's the one about the Grail. Anyway, it's one of the Indiana Jones. It's the one about the Grail, and there's this crevasse, this cavernous space, and he has to get to the other side, and he has to literally step out on faith. And when he takes that step, that leap, he finds that the bridge has been camouflaged all along. And he reaches back, he gets some sand, he throws it on, and the camouflaged bridge becomes visible. And so he's able then to go across this cavernous space and get to the other side. That is what I think of in Kierkegaard's leap of faith. You have to take the step. And when you take the step, the purpose and the meaning will be there. Now, this can be applied in so many other areas of life, not just to Christianity. I'll leave it for you to think about the application. The other part of that was when Indiana gets into the cave and he finds all of these chalices, all of these grails that are there, and if he drinks from the wrong one, if he chooses the wrong one, he'll die and he'll not be able to save his father. And so he makes a decision. Again, a leap of faith, very Kierkegaardian way of approaching this. And so he grabs what he thinks would be the chalice of a poor peasant-like carpenter, and he drinks from the chalice. And the guardian of the Grail says, "You have chosen wisely." And he doesn't die, and he's able to take the chalice back and heal his father. So 2 examples then of an act of faith, or as Kierkegaard would say, a leap of faith. He said this in his published work, The Sickness Unto Death. He said, "To have faith is to lose your mind and to win God." To have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. Maybe you can tell by how animated I am. I do like Hegel. Schopenhauer is pretty good too. I do love Kierkegaard. I love these continental philosophers. So in the next lecture, I'm going to stop this one, and I'll post the second one a little bit later when I finish it. I've already got my notes together and everything, but I wanted you just to have this first hour, to look at. So then I'll get to Marx, Nietzsche, and the ideas of utility. So guys, again, remember, there is no class presentation. That was my fault. But your annotated bibliography is due today. Today is the 20th. It's due today. And your next major project, of course, in just about 2 weeks, is your final paper. So be sure and get that stuff into me. All right. Have a good evening, and look for the second installment of this lecture very soon.